That's where I think we get anger wrong a lot of the time, is that anger can actually be like a very clarifying emotion. It's the emotion that tells you that you're worth defending and gives you the energy to do it, right? It's the most energizing emotion that we have.
I'm Kevin Maguire, and this is The New Fatherhood. Conversations with dads who are rewriting the parenting playbook. When I was about 11 years old, I watched a movie called Falling Down. I was way too young to be watching it at the time. I was the same age my daughter is now. I can't imagine her seeing this. The movie followed a character played by Michael Douglas, just a dad living in LA who's trying to make his way from one end of the city to the other to get home in time for his daughter's birthday. It's the hottest day of the year. Things don't go his way. And he snaps. He goes on a rampage. He goes on what feels like a righteous rampage. You're rooting for him because the world is unfair and only he is brave enough to do something about it. You're rooting for him because we grew up watching angry men. Dirty Harry, all the way through to Walter White. These archetypes of men and dads who are encouraged, allowed, even often expected to be angry. What kind of a film would they be if there's no rage there? A lot of dads were allowed to operate under a similar model. Dad was the disciplinarian. He was expected to keep the kids in line. Mum would say, just you wait until your dad comes home. That dad set the temper of the entire household. You learn to read his moods like looking out the window and trying to understand the weather. A lot of us grew up in houses with men like that. Today, anger is seen differently. The angry dad isn't so prevalent or socially accepted as he once was. But there's a different kind of anger that's taken its place. The anger that isn't expressed. The one that's turned inward. It's like the dad who says, same thing I used to say, I don't get angry. And what we mean by that is, I don't get aggressive. I don't shout, I don't lose control. But the anger comes out in other ways. Just doesn't disappear because you swallowed it. Today, I'm going to talk about anger with Sam Parker. Sam is an editor at GQ magazine in the UK and is the author of Good Anger, a book that makes the case that anger isn't something to be ashamed of, but actually something we should be curious about, as it's one of the most clarifying emotions we have. Sam and I get into all of it, what anger does to your body, and why the fantasy of we never argue can be a huge red flag for couples. Finally, Sam will share 5 words that can help you navigate any extreme emotional outburst. Hope you enjoy this. Welcome to the podcast, Sam Parker. Sam is an editor at GQ magazine. He is the author of Good Anger, and he's also the author of the weekly newsletter, The Good Father. Sam, good to have you here.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks for having me. And I have to say, I'm actually being inspired by you because when my partner was pregnant, she had a pile of books next to her bed of great writing about motherhood and what she could expect as a pregnant woman, you know, poetry and essays and all sorts of things. And I couldn't find anything for men that I liked. And then I found your writing online and your newsletter, and I started to find my way to writing that actually did make me feel a bit more prepared and actually inspired me to start writing myself about being a dad, writing in a way that I hadn't really written since I was a teenager, which was just to figure out all these emotions that were going on inside of me. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Sam. Wonderful. That's very nice of you to say. We're going to get going today, as we always do, I'm going to ask you, Sam, just tell me a little bit about your family.
Sure. So I live with my partner, Jessie, in Kent, not far from London, with our beautiful baby daughter, Olive. She was born last year, so she's almost 16 months old now. And yeah, we commute into London most days, Jessie and I, but we're based out in Kent, which is lovely.
And you became a dad after writing the book, but before the paperback came out.
Yes, I was writing the very last pages of it as she was sleeping next to me on the sofa, as a newborn, so trying not to disturb her while I typed away. So that was an interesting experience. And then, when the book came out on hardback, she was just big enough for me to put on my chest and take him to the bookshop to pick up a copy. So that was fun.
So Sam, the idea behind the book is that anger is not something that we should shy away from, but something that we should embrace, right?
Yeah, it's basically a call to completely re-examine and rethink what you think you know about anger, what you think it's for, to examine your personal relationship with it through a combination of my reporting as a journalist in the wellness space, but also my own personal therapeutic journey, I've become convinced that anger is kind of the left out component in the mental health conversation, and something that many people overlook, particularly the role it plays in anxiety and depression. And so trying to have a more open conversation about that, I think is really important.
So what was anger like for you growing up? Was it something that was encouraged? Was it something that was kind of like, because I know, as the kind of the core thesis of the new fatherhood is that we are the first generation of dads to really be kind of doing a lot of this work, interrogating the role models we grew up with, interrogating learning to feel the feelings that we were never allowed to feel as children.
Right.
Like, what was anger like for growing up, and kind of how did people show emotions in your house?
Anger was swept under the carpet quite a lot. And this is very common, I think, in households even today. Anger becomes a sort of almost like this metronome that the house vibrates to. When is anger going to erupt, and when is it going to go away again? And so there was certainly anger in my home because my parents would argue like all couples do. But there wasn't a lot of examination afterwards. There was no conversation around the anger after it occurred. And so that was kind of the environment that I grew up in, I think very typical of its time. And then, of course, I think when it comes to emotions, you kind of live in two worlds, don't you? There's your personal world created by your family and friends, but then there's also the external world where I think anger was, again, only really talked about in terms of violence and aggression. As though that was the kind of only anger problem, never really discussed in terms of suppression and repression, which I think is also actually a bigger anger problem, at least in terms of how many people it impacts. So not a lot of open conversation about anger when I was growing up, and it wasn't really until I got into my early 30s that I started figuring it out a bit for myself.
And a lot of that came reading your book through working with a therapist, Matt.
Yes.
Is that right? Like, what did working with Matt teach you about anger?
Well, first of all, Matt made me realize that I had any at all. So I was someone who would say to you with a straight face, I don't really get angry. I'm not an angry person. And you'll meet lots of people who say this.
I am one myself, Matt. I wrote it in my very book. It's like I don't get angry, and I could count on up until a point I could count on one hand the amount of times I got angry in the space of a decade.
Right. Very similar for me. But I think what I meant when I said that was that I don't show it. I don't get aggressive. I don't get into confrontations. I try and avoid that as much as I possibly can. And so what Matt made me realize was that anger is an emotion, one of the core emotions that we are all hardwired to feel. Aggression and violence and confrontation are behavioral choices. And just because you don't do that outward displaying behavior doesn't mean that the anger isn't there, it has to go somewhere. And I suppose the lesson that I learned through therapy was what I'd become very good at was turning anger in on myself. And, we talk about depression being anger turned inward a lot. I think that's a fairly, well-established principle now. But the real mind blower for me was actually anxiety can be anger turned inward as well. And so that's what I did. I was just an incredibly anxious person. I would drink to disguise that in my sort of weaker moments. And then in my stronger moments, I'd try and get rid of anxiety by jogging or doing yoga or, journaling or something. And nothing wrong with those things. But for me, it never really fixed the anxiety. And it was only when I started to realize that I was holding on to a lot of anger about the past, often in the present as well, and learning to kind of work through the emotion without resorting to the aggressive behavior, that I started to feel better and no longer anxious in a way that sort of ruined my life. So yeah, Matt was really the person who helped me realize all that. And of course, I can sum it up in 20 seconds, but this was like 8 years of work, with lots of periods where it didn't feel like it was working and lots of turns down the wrong avenues and so on. So it was a long process, but yeah, that's the sum of it.
And I think what you're saying here is that, if you do take it inward, and if you do point it in on yourself, it can be very detrimental to your mental health. Is that right? Should people be expressing anger? Do we need, because I think, what I got from the book is you and I think there's a lot of similarities in just learning how to accept and show anger in a way that feels kind of intentional and controlled. After not having had maybe great role models of how you show anger growing up, for me again, it was working with a therapist. I remember telling her, I was like, oh, I don't get angry. I never get angry with my kids. And she called out a particular thing that happened and said, if this happened, would you get angry? And I said, no. And she's like, why not? Because most people would get angry at that. And I said, well, because I'm worried. Like I walk out of the room. That's my coping. That's the way I cope. I stand up and I walk out. I get out of the situation. And she's like, why? And I said, I'm worried that I'm going to hit them. Like, I'm worried I'm going to hit my head. And she said in a second, she just said, you know that anger and violence are not the same thing. And it was almost this moment of like, wow, like, huh. I didn't know. And I think, so much of what you touch on in this book is about like how our relationship with anger really, like the things that we carry into our lives as adults and especially as fathers, really dictate the decisions that we make every day.
Yeah, everything you said just really, really resonates with me. And actually, somebody put it to me that aggression and violence isn't the ultimate expression of anger. It's actually a rejection of it. And that's something that's really stuck with me because, anger is basically alerting us to, most of the time, not exclusively, but a lot of the time, what it's alerting us to is a vulnerability that we feel, a fear, a perceived lack of respect, all these really like challenging feelings that it's signaling us towards. And actually, when you become aggressive and violent, it's like you're pushing the feeling out of the way. And rather than look at what it's alerting you to, which is a change you need to make or a wound that you have, you become violent instead. So that was sort of a moment a bit like the one you're describing where I went, okay, not only are they not the same thing, they actually can be like diametrically opposed things in terms of how you think about them and interpret them. And so, yeah, thinking about anger as a source of useful information was a real turning point for me as well. But I think, you started off asking about, should we vent it? It's funny, there was that therapy in the 70s, primal scream therapy comes up a lot when I talk to people, and the idea of, can you like scream it into a pillow and will that sort of cure you of your anger? I think there's a challenge that a lot of people have even before you get onto like whether that's a good way to process or not, which is recognizing it in the first place. And even just being aware of how anger can write itself across your body, right, is something that we're not really told about. We're not really educated about this unless you get into the right kind of therapeutic circles or. And so, I mention this a lot, but I think it's such a common one. But I used to grind my teeth at night. And I'd wake up feeling as though I'd been smacked in the jaw. And I just thought it was stress and anxiety. That's what I was told, But again, once I started to work on anger and become more comfortable with it, I realized that and many of the things that my body did, shaking my leg all the time, all these sorts of things, it was like it was anger trying to escape my body. And so even just learning to recognize that there's anger there at all, I think is the first step for many people, and it was for me. But then you get on to like, well, what do you do with it? And should you vent it? There's a bit of a catharsis myth, I think, to like just ventilation. And a really good example of this actually is what happens when we use social media, just to quickly alight on this. So if you go onto Twitter and say how angry you are about a thing, you do have a momentary feeling of satisfaction that you've done that. But it's actually been studied, like there's no like long-term resolution or usefulness to that emotion. Actually, it just keeps you mired. You want to go back for more. What you need in order for anger to feel sort of cathartically used is like a social resolution with someone else often. And so, you and I have a disagreement and we show each other our anger, but then we decide on a way forward that's kind of mutually beneficial or something like that. That's the time, that's when you get true catharsis with your anger. So just the ventilation isn't enough. It needs to like lead to something constructive. And people said to me very fairly, well, what is good anger? What do you mean by that? And the best way I can describe it, I think, is when you feel anger without shame or fear, and then you articulate it in a way that's proportionate, and it makes the situation better, not worse. And that's where, when we rush to kind of aggression and violence, it almost never does that. But equally, if we keep it in, then it won't do it either.
So Sam, tell me, like, what does a proportional response to anger look like?
I mean, it's going to differ depending on the circumstances, right? And I think a lot of it comes down to how safe you feel. And if your anger's been triggered by someone else, which it is most of the time. I think you have to ask yourself the question of like whether you can have that constructive conversation with that person, whether the trust is there. But if you decide that it is, there are certain things you can do that I've found really helpful. And one is to actually confess up front that you're feeling angry as you get into the conversation. It's called the discomfort caveat. And it's sort of something like, look, I'm angry right now, so I might not articulate myself as clearly as I could be. I might not be thinking as sort of logically as I could. Nevertheless, this is how I feel and this is what I want to say. And when you start with that kind of appeal to empathy with the other person, it often just keeps the conversation on the right kind of tracks, and stops it from getting sort of carried away. So that's one way you can find your way to a proportional response. But I think it's, on a more basic level than that, within yourself when you have an exchange with someone, whether you've been authentic to yourself or not, if that makes sense. It's like an inner feeling. And I think with anger, it's very, very clear. And if you've protected the other person over yourself and sort of not honored the extent of your anger, then I think you feel that as a kind of deficit. And I think more commonly, I suppose, in arguments, when you've gone a bit too far, you kind of know that as well. And so a lot of the time with anger, it's about returning to the conversation, and as painful as it can be, analyzing it once you're calm with that person and sort of divvying up what you stand by and what you don't. And to go back to the beginning of our conversation, what was missing from the anger conversation is that I saw around me growing up. I would say that's probably it, and no one, I don't think, should be advising fathers or parents in general to never, you must never lose your temper, or you must never let your anger get the better of you, because that's completely unrealistic. It's fine to do that. It's about how you repair afterwards, right? And the repairing is a large part of that, I think, is the analyzing and the pulling what was said back into proportion afterwards if you need to.
I mean, I don't think anger was ever socially acceptable, but it's become a lot more kind of filled with shame and socially irresponsible to kind of erupt and get angry. And, you still see people shouting and screaming at each other in the streets, but it feels like a much rarer occurrence than it felt like when I was a lot younger and growing up. The inevitable kind of end scenario of two men angry at each other is the punch up. And it's kind of like the real kind of like raw primal manifestation of anger between two people. And reading your book, Sam, is kind of like the punching plays a big story in your own kind of narrative as well, in kind of how you started to come to terms or kind of understand your anger a little bit more. What happened there? So
I'd decided to take up boxing, which immediately sounds like a terrible cliche for a man in his mid-30s. But I was having a very anxious year and was trying all sorts of different things to try and get a handle on it, including lots of different exercises. And someone randomly suggested boxing to me, and I did a class and quite liked it. And so I got into this habit of going down the gym and using the bag. And I tell the story at the start of the book, but I went down there one day and was sort of punching away and just felt this surge of sort of energy and power coming up through my body from my legs upwards. And it was like something I'd never experienced before. And I kind of, was punching away for what felt like ages. Probably wasn't that long in reality, but to me it was. And then at the end of it, I realized that I was furious. That was what it had unlocked in me, was this kind of fury. And I'd been anxious and depressed for so many months. It never would have occurred to me that anger should play any part in this. But suddenly the conversations I needed to have were very crisp in my mind. And, the people who were that I needed to speak to, it was very, very clear to me. I had a lot of clarity in my mind. And that came from anger. And that's where I think we get anger wrong a lot of the time, is that anger can actually be like a very clarifying emotion. It's the emotion that tells you that you're worth defending and gives you the energy to do it, right? It's the most energizing emotion that we have. And I'd never thought about anger in these terms. To me, anger was just something that happened when something awful has occurred and you've lost yourself and you've settled on something stupid, and then you should feel ashamed of it. But the idea that anger just as an emotional state could bring clarity and wisdom and be helpful was something I'd never thought about. But it was through punching, ironically, which is, what you shouldn't do when you get angry. But through doing that in a safe and controlled way is how I access the emotion. And when I started researching the book, I spoke to people who had similar experiences, but using different physical activities. It wasn't always fighting. But that was the thing that unlocked it for me. But yeah, somewhat ironic that it's the very thing you shouldn't do when you get angry, which is, go and thump someone. But it worked.
But like unlocking that for you, and I'm curious. You've researched so much about anger. Like I'm curious to get into like what is it? Like what is it in the body? What is happening to us physiologically when we get angry?
Well, it's described as a negative emotion, which I used to hear that and think it meant it was like undesirable or bad for us, which is another misconception. So a negative emotion just means that we experience it as unpleasant most of the time. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't have it or that it's not good for us. And so it tends to manifest in different people in different ways. Once you've lost your temper, it means that your amygdala has been hijacked. And you're actually, so if we talk about the state that where you've just lost your head, it's like your brain has been scrambled, and we all can, relate to that feeling. So we experience it as this like scratchy, unpleasant feeling a lot of the time, but it's really your body that telling you that a boundary violation has taken place, something is not right, a change needs to be made. And it could be as simple as someone's pushed into you and you have to activate your body to defend yourself. But, most of anger is generated socially, and it's your mind pointing you towards something you need to change. But where it gets confusing is that it's very often not really about the trigger. That person who's just reminded you of something deep in your unconscious, or has made you feel insecure in another area of your life. And so that's really what your body is responding to. So it's very, very complex. But, when you start to unpick it properly, then you can learn a lot.
But tell me, like that a boundary has been kind of violated, a boundary has been crossed, is going to be so different from everyone. And everyone's boundaries are different. And I think so many men will not even understand what their boundaries are.
Yes.
I think as a, I think a lot about this experience that happened where my daughter was in like nursery. She was 4. And there was a kid who fell over in the class and he cut his knee open and there was blood. Like he cut his knee open big, right? Like deep cut, blood everywhere down his leg. And the kid was just completely and utterly emotionless. And my daughter was telling me, she's like, there's so much blood and he did it. And I remember speaking to the dad at the gate and I said, hey, like your son, I heard he had a really bad cut. And he's like, yeah. And I said, but he was fine. He wasn't crying. He's like, no, of course not. Like all my boys know that boys don't cry. Right. And you see that it seems strange for a dad to say something like that today in, 2026 or 2020 when it happened. But that's the way it has always been.
Yes.
And as a gender, we are taught to hide these emotions away. We're taught not to show them. And we're taught that even showing emotions is, it's like a very female, like all the language around showing emotions is like, don't be a pussy, man up, grow a pair, like all this stuff. Like how are men learning to understand what their boundaries are and then to understand what is the kind of like right reaction to take when someone steps over them? Yeah,
it's complicated, isn't it? And another example of this, I think, on anger, before coming back to men, is that women often cry when they get angry. And it's kind of like the inversion of this, of what you're talking about. And I interviewed many women in the chapter of the book about work, who said that when they get really angry and frustrated in a work context, they find themselves tearing up. And that's really unideal for them because, crying in a work context isn't always super helpful. It can be judged certain ways and so on. And so it can be a source of real frustration. And it happens without them meaning to, because they have this racket emotion for anger, which is tears, because they've internalized the idea that anger is not appropriate for them. And so I think often with boys, the boy shouldn't cry, shouldn't be upset, shouldn't cry even if your knee is, pouring with blood. Well, what do you replace sadness with? Well, anger. But it's not anger that we're talking about where it's authentic and there's something to learn from it. It's just aggression for aggression's sake. And I think a lot of boys grow up with an idea of their boundaries that are way out of whack because they can be very easily angered. perhaps not the way that you and I went with this, from what we're saying about ourselves. But I think a lot of young boys grew up with the idea that actually the one emotional expression they are allowed is aggression, is like out and out anger. And so anytime they feel vulnerable, anytime they feel challenged, anytime they feel insecure or afraid, anger is the place that they'll go to. Or sorry, I should say aggression, because that's really what it is. So I think we tell boys it's okay for them to be aggressive and angry, but what we never tell them is that they can be curious as to why that is, and ask questions about that, and look at what's going on under the bonnet of that feeling. So it's more like a behavior response than a truly felt emotion a lot of the time. So I think a lot of male anger is really something else in disguise. And so when you've been raised in that way, knowing where your boundaries are and when it's appropriate to act with aggression or not is very, very difficult. I find that difficult anyway. Here's something I think is important and particularly useful with parenting and relationships is like talking about anger when you're not angry. And having that conversation with your friends and your partner and your loved ones and your children, like, hey, let's talk about anger when nobody's angry, and talk about, a time in the week when we experience this or certain things that make us angry and why might that be, and make it a topic of exploration and curiosity. I think that's one way you can start to figure your boundaries out a little bit, But we don't tell young guys any of this stuff, do we?
No, we don't, and they're not learning it, and there's no role models out there. I think a lot about watching Inside Out with my son, and Inside Out having this this wonderful shorthand to be able to talk about your emotions.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, this is the red guy is at the controls now, the blue woman is at the controls, and I think there's something in your book that really kind of resonated with me, with this idea of like good anger and bad anger. Like, what is the difference, and how would a dad know which one is presenting itself?
It's very tricky in the context of fatherhood, which is something that I'm just learning myself, which is why I decided to write a new chapter for the paperback, which is about anger in toddlers and how we can sort of learn to start to understand that. Because, of course, you can do all this work on anger in yourself, and then you have kids and it feels like it's been thrown out of the window, right? That doesn't really help. It's really, really hard. I think, do you kind of like have conversations with your kids about anger specifically? Have you found that that's helped at all?
Yeah, we do. So my two are 11 and 6, and we've been through like all various different stages of understanding anger, like learning how to express it healthily, learning what unhealthily expression of anger looks like. There's I'm very militant about running an unmilitant household, right? It's like there is no violence, there is no even threat of violence around things. And I've said to my kids on many occasions when they get angry at each other and they hit each other, it's like, hey, I grew up in a household where people hit each other and it's not nice. Yeah. If you would like this to be one of those houses, this is the way to do it. If you would like this house to not be one of those houses, let's not hit each other. And I think, in my experience, like learning how to express anger has been quite a journey for me, right? From this place like you was like, I don't get angry. I'm so proud. I like, look how great I am. Look how like enlightened I am. I never get angry at anything. And again, a therapist saying, that's not healthy.
Yeah.
And this therapy, Sam, was after I dealt with a bout of paternal postnatal depression after my son was born. And again, it's like a lot of things rolled up into the meaning of like what it meant to be a dad, what it meant to raise a son, like all of these things that kind of came to the fore. And now it's like I feel myself kind of, you talk about proportional response. I feel myself getting to this level of going, has my threshold been crossed for me to get angry right now? And if it's getting close, I'll tell my kids. I'll be like, we're getting there. Like, okay, I'm here. And if you want to keep going, we can keep going. But like, this is the warning that you have before. Again, like not a privilege that I was granted growing up, for sure. And I think with them, it's like they're learning. It's like I don't know if you read the Whole Brain Child by Daniel Siegel and Tina Bryson. fantastic book. It is a must-read parenting book because it teaches you how, it just talks through how their brain is developing and how every difficult situation that your child goes into is an opportunity for you to help them develop the skills necessary to kind of like develop all these different kind of neural pathways, but ways of managing conflict and tough emotions. And, so I think about that all the time. It's like, getting into that moment and going, okay, like here's a chance. Like I see my son is upset or I see my daughter is mad at something else. Like I'm going to sit with them. I'm going to be with them and be with that emotion and not to do what the previous generations would have done, which is like, don't feel like stop or I'll give you something to cry about. The famous kind of line from so many people's childhoods. It's like a threat of violence to stop the kind of like worry about anger and violence. It's just like being with them and being in that space. And it's hard. It's, because I think one of the things that I read a while ago, and it feels so true, is that one of the things you struggle with most with your own children is what you were not allowed to do as a child yourself. So when you see them exhibiting behaviors that would have kind of like got you in a lot of trouble as a kid, and then not being any repercussions for it, it can be very triggering for you as an adult.
That's so interesting. And I think actually the way you describe the way you report your anger to your children before it's overwhelmed you. So you're neither keeping it bottled in nor allowing it to get out of control. And you do that like in a staggered way. Like to me, that's a brilliant example of good anger, right? That's like finding the through line between repression and losing your mind, losing your head. That can be so tricky. But when you do it, you're making the situation better, right? Because you're showing your kids that they need to be conscious of how you feel about things. They need to be socially aware. They need to sometimes modify their own impulses and desires and all the rest of it. So you're showing them all this like good stuff by being honest about your anger. And I think this is where it's so easy to go wrong, particularly as a father, because, we know that our anger is an incredibly like powerful thing, in a household to a child. I mean, I have a daughter and so many of my female friends have told me just how much of their inner world and their memories of growing up and all these really deep, rich, profound things, how much that's been shaped by their father's anger, and how they showed their anger and how their temper worked. And, it's true for boys as well, of course. But it's this incredibly powerful thing. So to be thoughtful about it and to be proportional with it and honor it without succumbing to it, which is what you're describing, I think that's the essence of good anger. But the thing is, you can never do it 100% of the time. It's just impossible. And so then what are you left with? All you're left with is holding your hands up and saying, hey, look, I got it wrong that time.
And I think, Sam, you cop to this in the book of talking about like becoming a father and sleepless nights and a long hot summer and just kind of really losing your temper yourself.
Yes. Yeah. We hadn't slept for what felt like, 25 years. It was probably about 2 weeks. And I write about this in the book, but, our daughter was very little. She was still sleeping in the room with us. And I was drifting off to sleep for the first time in ages. And, my partner, Jessie, said something to me and we got into some argument and I raised my voice enough that my daughter woke up and started crying. And it's like I could feel the cortisol, rushing through her body as a result of my voice. And it was really, really tough because you can't really repair with a baby. You can hug it out, but you can't explain what's happened. But I find that, moments like that, if you shame yourself too much for them, or if you try and construct a household where it never happens, that's its own kind of inauthentic. That's its own kind of problem. And so I do think you can overcorrect and try and banish anger and disagreement and argument and things, which is not good either. So repairing when it's gone wrong and being as truthful and honest to it in the moment as you can, I think is about the best that we can do. And it sounds like what you're describing.
I think you're in a fascinating moment, Sam, because you are an expert in anger and you're fairly new to parenting and fatherhood. I think that perspective that you have, like, how do you, coming into this with fresh eyes, like, what do you, like, how can parents invite anger into the house? Like, how can they begin to see anger in a more positive way?
I think the proactive conversation, I made this point already, but I think this is such an important one. Like, have a conversation around the table at dinner when everybody's happy and more or less getting along. Talk about anger. What made you angry this week? Don't let it become a taboo. Like, it was such a taboo when I was growing up, the idea that one might lose their temper or that you could be angry. And then when it did happen, it was a catastrophe and a disaster. And, anything you can do to like lower that taboo, I think is really, really important. I think that, my daughter's just starting to show signs of anger herself now. So you're right, I'm a complete rookie with this, but when she does, push something away or just assert herself in an angry way, I actually try and, I have an instant response to it, which is objection. But then I try and very quickly tell myself to value it and to think, this is great. This is good. I need to let her feel she can continue to do this. And when she gets old enough to understand the difference between emotion and behavior, like, we'll talk about that then. But being with her, and not shaming her when she's angry and giving her the space to be angry in its fullness, and maybe even join her in the energy with it in terms of talking, with empathy about where she is. I think that's all good stuff, but you can then draw the line between, okay, yes, but also you don't hit someone as a result, and help them see that demarcation between emotion and behavior. That's the theory anyway, Kevin. I'm sure if we speak in a couple of years, I'll be...
Let's see. Yeah. No, but I think, I'm laughing to myself thinking about like bringing up like all the times we've been angry at the dinner table on a very nice Friday night is a surefire way to get my kids very angry. Like talking about being angry at a good time, like what? But I think it's, I think we learn a lot about these emotions from our children.
Yeah.
They're kind of like empathy generating machines. Right? You can't help but from when they're tiny, you have to learn to understand, like, what are they feeling? They can't say what they're feeling. So you have to start to sense it and get a better idea of it. And I think that is this just huge thing for so many men where we have spent our entire lives really only caring about ourselves. We have partners and wives that we care about very much. And then I think when a child comes along, for many men, it's the first time they've probably cared about someone outside of 11 men playing football on a weekend. But it's the first time they've cared about another human being more than themselves.
No, it's so true what you're saying. And I think another element of that is being selfless without acknowledgement or reward. I think fatherhood is when you get inducted in that, really. A lot of men, you have to be the better, higher version of yourself. And actually you need to do it in a way that nobody's going to acknowledge or pat you on the back for. It's just what you have to do for them. It's funny, isn't it? I think I know some men who've become fathers and really embraced that side of it, and others who've kind of, turned and ran from it. And I don't like to judge people anywhere on that spectrum because everybody's having that response for their own set of reasons. But it's it's very tough and complicated stuff. And, you touched before on the how it triggers your memories of your own childhood and so on. And, that just gets truer and truer as it goes on, I think, from what I've heard from, parents with teenagers and even older children.
I think the job that so many fathers are taking on, find themselves like carrying, even if they're not taking it on by choice, is the job to like intentionally decide what they pass on to their children and what they kind of do the work to ensure the buck stops with them.
Yes.
Right. And I think that is just the most challenging work for any dad to do. And it's like, it's a new muscle for us. You're saying about dads showing anger. It was, and how many kind of children's entire kind of upbringings were colored by it. But that was dad's role. That was like, when you think about like the role that dad had in the house, like when I think back to my family, my dad worked, when I was a young kid, my dad worked away 5 days a week, right? He was in civil engineering. He would go and just like go and dig holes and build motorways. And my mum's thing would be, just wait till your dad gets home. Like it would be this threat of like the disciplinarian will return soon, so you better behave, otherwise this is what's going to happen. It's like dad's anger was almost encouraged or expected as this like iron fist that would keep the whole house in line.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And I think about that old father figure, you know, the provider and the discipline and the discipline. And that's kind of what you did. You provided materially and you disciplined. And, you know, I feel sorry for those father figures in a lot of ways. When, you know, and we're generalizing a lot. There would have been exceptions, of course, but, you know, that Victorian figure of the father, if you go back that far, I feel like those men missed out on so much that was amazing about being a dad. But then the flip side was that they didn't have to do the tough stuff, you know, the childcare and the work of it and so on. And so it was this kind of double-edged thing, but it doesn't look like a good deal to me at all. But I think the thing that I think we overlook about men a lot in the mental health conversation is that men are very, very motivated by feeling competent and useful. And we desperately want to be competent and useful, and we desperately want the people who love us to view us that way. And so being competent and useful by going out and working is something that we can do without really having to change from who we were before we became fathers. And so in some sense, that role is comfortable, although it can be hard work and all the rest of it. It's, you know, it's familiar. Now we're in an era when men, I think, you know, my generation of parents, fathers, really want to be competent and useful in the other way, in the nurturing side of raising kids. And that's really, really tough because in the most cases, we haven't been equipped with the tools to do it. And so, you know, I know this is the essence of your work, but, you know, that idea of like our generation of fathers as like pioneers without much of a map, I think is really, really true when it comes to this topic of like, well, how can we actually pull our weight in terms of being an emotional support to our partners, to our children, teaching good mental health, good emotional regulation, modeling it in ourselves, not just demanding it of our kids. Like, these are really, really tough things, and a lot tougher in some ways than just going out and bringing home the bacon, which of course now mums do as well.
This is the shift, Sam, is that, you know, we've seen women making these changes over the last like 100 years or more. And it's like, I don't just want to be the person who raises the children and looks after the home. I want to have my own career. I want to show up. I want to be successful in and outside of the home. And I think, Sam, on the flip of that, there is like the ugly cousin of anger that can definitely present itself in long-term relationships, and especially where children are present, is resentment.
Yes.
You know, that's the kind of the anger that is allowed, that isn't expressed, but is just kind of like allowed to build and to fester. And, you know, like, I'm curious if when you were working on the book, if you saw any signs or any stories around that, and like how learning about those, you know, I know that you write about Gottman in the Gottmans in the book, and obviously resentment is one of the four horsemen of the marriage apocalypse. So it's like, how does resentment and anger, how do they play into each other? And like, what do parents need to do to make sure that they don't go down that route? Yeah,
the other horseman, or one of the other horsemen they talk about, is contempt, right? And if you see a couple who speak to each other with contempt, then that's a terrible red flag for that relationship. And I think that is true. You know, contempt is really just anger that's been allowed to sort of curdle and become bitter, and because it wasn't really discharged properly, it wasn't recognized properly, and it sort of has turned into something else. You know, that's where I think the role of anger in relationships is a little bit underestimated as well, because again, it's like the fantasy of a relationship is like, oh, we never argue. It's great. We never argue. And it's like, well, hang on a second. Are you sure that's great, actually? Because if you never argue, then you don't really ever break apart, you know? And we're all on this like continuum of rupture and repair all of the time with any intimate relationship. In order to rupture properly, you have to be able to say that you're angry, and you have to be able to do it in a way that doesn't damage the relationship long term, which is where we get into, you know, contempt and those sorts of things. So learning how to express anger, recognize and then express anger without shame and fear is not just something that we do for ourselves, it's something we do for our partners as well. And then that becomes something we do for our children. And so within a relationship that's working, there has to be periods where you break apart symbolically, and that has to be driven by acknowledging when you're angry with each other, because we're going to make each other angry, particularly when you're trying to raise kids, right? So, and it's all stuff that when you talk about it, it feels very obvious, but so many relationships ignore anger until it's turned into aggression, brush it to one side when it's occurred, and then it creeps back in as resentment and contempt, which is what we're talking about. And that's just like anger dysfunction from every direction. So one of the best things you can do for your relationship, I think, is be very, very purposeful and sort of proactive about your anger, and figure out the stuff that pisses you off about each other that actually has nothing to do with each other. That was a big one for my partner and I. Was like, why do we keep arguing about these things? Well, actually, when I think about it, it's because when you say this type of thing, it makes me feel something about my past. It's not really about you, and all that kind of stuff. And I think if you can go on that journey together a little bit, my partner and I were lucky, I suppose. We were together for 7 years before Olive came along, and there were some reasons for that were out of our control, but some that were deliberate. And we did a lot of growing together in that time, and it's a lot easier to figure some of this stuff out before you've got children. And I think couples sometimes miss that opportunity. They can be together for years and then have kids and be like, well, why are we like this? It's like, well, you had all that time to be curious about it, really.
Also, I'm the couples that like, well, this isn't really working, but let's have a baby. Ooh. And that will help us. Yeah. That will bring us closer together.
That'll make it easier.
Yeah, that ain't gonna make anything easier.
Yeah, and it's really sad when that happens, because we all know who pays the price for that, and it's the children. It's the children who are gonna carry the burden of the dysfunction that exists between you and your partner. And that's a legacy that many of us live with, and it's not fair.
Sam, I realize a lot of this conversation that we've had has been very much around the two guys who have maybe not expressed anger enough, learning how to get in touch and express anger more. I think there are a lot of dads who read the newsletter and who'll be listening to this who are coming at it from the complete other side. And they're like, I want to be angry less. Like, I want to, like, what would you say? Like, what advice would you give a dad who is just like constantly losing his shit with his kids and just wants to do something differently?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I mean, look, my book is mostly about and for people who have what I call the other anger problem, which is the tendency to repress. Having said that, whether you're an anger out or an anger in person, it kind of comes back to the same problem, which is that you're uncomfortable with anger and what it's alerting you to. And it comes back to what I said earlier about actually aggression is kind of like a rejection of anger more than its true face. And I think if you start to reframe anger to yourself that way, that's a decent starting point. So, when I lose my temper, that's a behavior, that's a reaction, that's probably something I've learned. It's something that I don't do by choice, something I wish I didn't. But that doesn't mean that you like throw the baby out with the bathwater and you banish the whole experience, right? There's the core first anger that you felt that you then responded to. Like, there's good stuff there for you, and there's something worth looking at there and thinking about. Someone used a really good expression for me that stuck in my head a while ago, which is, if it's hysterical, it's historical. If your reaction to something your kids do or your partners do is hysterical in nature, if it's outsized to the situation and what's happened, that really there's a very, very strong chance that what's actually happened here is that it's alerted you to something from your past, something you haven't dealt with, something you haven't looked at, something you're afraid of, a door that you don't want to open, and I think that's where you need to really get like real with yourself and curious. And I think men who have this problem of like always losing their temper should just really sit in a quiet moment and take stock of like, what are the patterns that are leading to this, and what might it really be about? And That's a really difficult question to answer on your own. And, you and I are sat here, two men who've done a lot of therapy and read a lot of books about it and had the privilege of that opportunity to go and do that work and that discovery. It's not something that people have automatically, and it's not something everybody can access. So that's a big challenge. But if you do have the opportunity to get some help and you do have the resources and the time to explore it, then do it, because, life's too short not to. And if you're constantly getting hysterically angry with your family and your friends and your loved ones, then it's not about them. It's about something else. And being honest with yourself about that I think is the first step.
I run as part of the new fatherhood, I run a therapy fund. I kind of set it up about 3 or 4 years ago, that 10% of all the subscription, 10% of everything just goes into a pot. And any dads anywhere in the world can kind of just send me an email and I hook them up with a therapist wherever they are and pay for 5 sessions.
That's brilliant.
And it's just been this thing where I just went, you know what? It's like, it has helped me so much. It's like, it's helped you. It's helped it helps so many people, but not everyone has access to it, especially in the US where, you lose your job and you lose all the kind of support that you get. So,
and
it's really,
I'd say one thing on that, and that's an incredible thing to do. And another reason why I think it's even more powerful today is that so many people are getting therapy, so-called, from chatbots and from AI. And I understand why they're doing it. But, the biggest breakthroughs I had in therapy were when I had the psychological safety of speaking to this person for over a long period. And he told me something I didn't want to hear. He used a word to describe me or my behavior or the persona I was presenting or something. Once he knew I was ready to hear it, I really didn't want to hear, and I had to, and that's what you don't get from from a chatbot. You
ain't going to get hard truths. No. You ain't going to get hard truths from a chatbot.
No. So if you're doing work there to hook people up with the real deal, and I think that's if I could wave a magic wand tomorrow, it would be to give more people access to that, because figuring this stuff out, the things we're talking about, particularly anger, on your own, I would never have done it. There's not a chance that I would have, no chance at all. I needed a patient partner and I needed a therapist over the long term. And I'm sure it's probably true for a lot of people.
Sam, I got one last question before I let you run off into the night. There is a lot of anger in the world right now. What do you think people should do with theirs?
A lot of the spaces that we communicate in, get our information from, are designed to keep us angry without a cathartic resolution. We touched on that earlier. There are great forces at work in the world right now designed to keep us angry, but not really curious about why. And so I think if you want to do something constructive with your anger, start thinking about it in a curious way and start talking about it with people who can actually hear you. Don't just vent it out into the world, for kind of rewards that aren't real, or for attention that isn't there. So I think use your anger as a source of information, a source of wisdom and a source of energy, and direct it into making your life better. And it takes a lot of practice, but it really can work.
It's brilliant. Thanks so much for talking to us, Sam.
Thanks, Kevin.
The New Fatherhood is hosted by me, Kevin Maguire. Our managing producer is Elizabeth Van Brocklin. Sound editing by Sam Williams. Our theme tune is by Son. You can find links and resources from this episode in the show notes. If you enjoyed this conversation, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. If you loved it, why not share it with another dad you think would appreciate it? Or maybe leave a review. It really does help other people find the show. Thanks for listening. See you next time.